diehard, man, but I ain't getting no goddamn trunk.
You are not bringing this fucking bitch into my house!
It's not gonna shoot.
You know, it's funny.
K-Billy's super sounds of the 70s weekend just keeps on coming.
The year was 1962, Knoxville, Tennessee. The talented 15-year-old Connie McHugh finishes school early and gets a job as a nurse at the local hospital. One day after work, she meets a charming actor and musician named Tony Tarantino. After a few months, they get married, and a few months after that, they split. As a parting gift, Tony leaves his ex-wife a surprise, a little of his DNA, which 9 months later receives a name.
After we separated, I found out I was pregnant and never even contacted him.
Gunsmoke, starring James Arness.
During her pregnancy, Connie watched the TV show Gunsmoke, where the enchanting Burt Reynolds played the role of Quint Asper. The young girl was enamored with the character and decided to name her future child after him.
But I wanted a more formal name than Quint. And then I was reading a Faulkner book, The Sound and the Fury. The heroine's name was Quentin, so I decided that my child was going to be named Quentin, whether it was male or female. I was also looking for a limited number of nicknames. The shortest would be Quent, which I promptly shortened for Q, the name by which most of his friends refer to him.
Connie married again when Q turned 2. She chose a musician named Kurt Zastapil. Kurt gave Quentin his last name and adopted him. The family moved to Los Angeles, where Quentin's mother began a successful career in pharmacology. Her career began to take off, and they settled in South Bay, one of the nicest neighborhoods of the city. His mother's love for television and the cinema seemed to genetically pass down to Quentin. He began to go to the movies before he could walk. He was barely 5 when his mother would take him to movies like Carnal Knowledge and Deliverance.
You better run, you son of a bitch!
While his peers were watching things like Dumbo and The Jungle Book, he was enjoying The Wild Bunch and Midnight Cowboy.
I'm walking here! I'm walking here!
The child became consumed with films. He rehearsed scenes from them with his toys and often pretended to be the hero from various movies. This obsession was of no help at school, and though his IQ was a school record-breaking $160, it didn't seem to reflect in his grades. Teachers recognized his talent, but he was terrible at writing and math. In addition, he was so restless and disobedient that the school psychologist tried to convince Connie to start giving him sedatives, but she refused to do that. The boy couldn't tell the time, ride a bike, or swim, but he could describe every film that he had ever seen, say which actors were in them, who directed it, and dreamed only of becoming an actor. As the years passed, nothing changed, and at 16, he dropped out of school with his mother's blessing.
I could tell him off every day and have him hanging out on street corners, or I could let him quit, and I thought I'd actually have more control over him if I let him stay at home. I wanted him to see that life without an education would not be a picnic.
But a picnic it was. Having reverted to his birth father's last name, which was more compatible with a Hollywood career, he easily found work in the film industry. At first, he became a cashier in an adult movie theater. However, the dream of many teens in the 70s didn't resonate with him. He loved real films and considered pornos to be cheap, disgusting, and boring.
Who the hell are you? What are you doing here?
He spent his salary on acting classes. Q attended James Best Group, an actor who rose to fame thanks to the movies Shock Corridor and Verboten. Best method was simple. He wasn't producing the next Sophia Loren or Marlon Brando. He was getting his students ready for regular roles on TV. So the most important thing he taught was how to behave naturally on camera.
You gotta be a great actor. You gotta be naturalistic. You gotta be naturalistic as hell.
After finishing the class, he created his first acting resume, which was basically a few lines of bald-faced lies. For example, he had written that he had played in George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. This movie was chosen on purpose, because at the time it was impossible to double-check. It was 1983. Quentin was already 20 years old, but his career stubbornly refused to take off. He had no idea then that a random visit to a rental store called Video Archives would cause his life to turn upside down. He came by as a film buff one day and we started talking about movies. Got into a discussion about Brian De Palma. 4 hours later, we were still talking. He came back the next day and talked about Sergio Leone. Eventually, I offered him a job, working for $4 an hour with permission to sign out as many videos as he liked, free of charge.
You got a boss, right?
Yeah,
Hey, what's his name?
Lance.
That's him.
Until I became a director. It was the best job I ever had. The store made up for any film education that Quentin might have missed. Every day it was filled with heated, 8-hour discussions about film. Each participant was constantly digging through the collection of 9,000 tapes in order to find just the right film and prove their case. This was not the place where the customer was always right. In fact, just the opposite. You could get insulted if you didn't appreciate Scorsese, or if you never heard of Francois Truffaut. If you came intending to get Hercules in New York, Tarantino would force you to get Blowout, and instead of playing Disney cartoons or the latest Schwarzenegger film, the store played pictures of Goodart and John Woo. The rundown rental store became a haven for all the cinephiles of Los Angeles, where young Quentin amazed the regulars with his phenomenal memory. I always prided myself on my cinema knowledge. Who directed what? Who starred in it?
And Quentin would go on to tell you who the supporting cast was, who the DP was, who wrote the screenplay.
Thanks to these circumstances, a small group of like-minded companions formed around Quentin. Roger Avery, a young director working at Video Archives. Craig Hammond, whom Quentin befriended while attending James Best acting classes. And Rand Vossler, who was a beginning screenwriter and director and often visited the rental store. In those days, Craig Hammond and Tarantino were like brothers, spending all their free time together. They studied every Italian and Chinese film they could get their hands on. Hammond suggested they combine their powers and write a screenplay together, which led to My Best Friend's Birthday.
Mean, nasty, rude. I mean, he couldn't give a fuck about anything except rocking and rolling, live fast, die young, and have a good-looking corpse.
I got something for you. Jesus Christ. Do I get anything in my nose? Not right here. Okay, cool. Okay, ready? Yeah. It's K-Billy, and we're back on the air.
The friends invested all their money in the creation of this picture. Still, the budget was so small that Tarantino made up for any lacking actors, and they filmed at his mom's house and a friend's bar. The shooting team was made up of 3 people. Quentin, the director, the administrator Roger Avery, and the cameraman Rand Vossler. The friends threw all their energy into the production, hoping this movie would help them get a little attention and further their careers. But the film was never finished. The laboratory where the film was being stored had a fire that destroyed the majority of the footage. However, it was obvious from the few fragments that were saved that Tarantino's signature style had already begun to develop.
So you don't know Eddie. He is really strong. And really mean. I'm really jealous.
Freeze, Packer!
And I'm very pissed, all right?
The main source of this style was his own personality. Q always wore black, ate hamburgers, read comics, and drove an old Honda Civic. His phenomenal memory helped him find inspiration for dialogues just by overhearing conversations.
Quentin has a mind for a dialogue. He can repeat a conversation you've had 10 or 15 years ago verbatim.
One of the best places for gathering information was prison, where Quentin ended up 3 times. Each time, it was because of unpaid parking tickets. He was so distracted that he was fined $3,000 in parking tickets alone.
He's in Cameo, expected. What for?
traffic tickets, gone warrant. They stopped him for something, found warrants on him, took him accountable.
In 1984, Hammond introduced Tarantino to beginning producer Catherine James. She helped the young talent, who only had a short and falsified resume under his belt, to get at least some kind of work in cinema. 10 years later, James helped produce Pulp Fiction. But back then, she was only able to help him get a cameo role in Golden Girls, where he played an Elvis impersonator. This episode was later included in a clip of the show's best moments and was often played on TV, thanks to which Quentin received royalties every time it was aired. At the same time, Roger Avary gave Quentin his script to read. Open Road was about a couple in love who ended up on the wrong side of the law. Q liked it, and he spent a lot of time convincing Avary to finish it. Roger was always busy and clearly burned out, so he asked Quentin to do it himself. He agreed and took the task very seriously. He got so into it that he quit his job at Video Archives and moved back in with his mother. However, in order to pay his parking fines, he got a job as a traveling salesman at Imperial Entertainment. His job was to sell cassettes to stores, like the one he worked for before. In a few months, there was almost nothing left of the original Open Road, and Avary's draft was used to create 2 screenplays, True Romance and Natural Born Killers. He finished True Romance first and decided to make the film himself, since his acting career didn't seem to be going anywhere. And the only way to get a part in a movie was to make it himself.
You know, it's not right. It's not right, and it's not fucking fair.
Natural Born Killers was written with one goal in mind: sell the script and use the money to shoot True Romance. Unfortunately, nobody wanted anything to do with either of the scripts. Quentin didn't give up and decided to rework an old idea about the robbery of a jewelry store. Having completely devoted himself to his new work, Quentin first gave the rights to Natural Born Killers to Rand Vossler, who had helped him make My Best Friend's Birthday, and later, thanks to Catherine James, sold True Romance to the American Screen Actors Guild for the minimum amount allowed, $30,000. As 1989 unfolded, he had money and was working on a new screenplay called Reservoir Dogs. In order to avoid the same fate as his last projects, he decided not to spend the money and set aside the money for shooting. Thanks to his first official sale, you could say that Tarantino became a professional screenwriter in the eyes of Hollywood, which led to his first gig. Special effects expert Robert Kurtzman hired him to rewrite his script about vampires. He offered him $1,500 and promised to help with special effects on any of Quentin's future projects. Tarantino agreed and rewrote the whole thing. That is how From Dusk Till Dawn came into being. But Kurtzman was unable to shoot it. At one point, Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger, showed interest, but later changed his mind. This became Quentin's third project, which was resigned to gather dust on the shelf. When he received his next job, Quentin quit his salesman's job. For his work editing the dialogues in Past Midnight, starring Rutger Hauer as the lead, he was paid $8,000, though we wouldn't call it editing exactly.
They hired me to do a dialogue polish, all right? And it became like a page 1 rewrite. And then by the time they made the movie, it became half my rewrite and half of the original script.
Maybe you're giving him too much credit. Maybe Jordan just isn't a natural born killer.
Thanks to After Midnight, Quentin's name appeared in the credits for the first time. About that time, Q befriended Scott Spiegel, co-author of the movie Evil Dead 2. They met totally randomly when they struck up a conversation in line at a movie theater. Spiegel was impressed by Quentin's erudition and invited him to party at his house. When Scott heard the name Tarantino, he remembered another person with that same last name, whose script True Romance he had recently read. When Quentin told him it was his work, Spiegel was amazed and promised him that no matter what, he would help him make a movie. The next day, he convinced Lawrence Bender, the producer of his latest film, to work with Tarantino. That meeting became a turning point for both their careers. Tarantino worked with Lawrence as a producer for the next 19 years.
There's another asshole, my producer, right next to him, man. tapping his fucking watch.
Bender immediately advised Quentin to focus on making Reservoir Dogs. Tarantino finished the script in just 3 weeks and wanted to start shooting right away, using the money from True Romance and his friends as actors. But Bender asked Quentin for 1 year to seek financing worthy of a professional movie.
What happened was, I told Lawrence, all right, look, I'm going to be writing this film. I'm going to start with it next month, and I'm going to be finished with it in a few days. All right, so I write it and finish it, and I show it to him, and he goes, this is pretty good. Why don't we try to get this going as a real movie? All right, no, I've heard that all before. Forget it. I don't trust that. I'd spent 6 years trying to get deals on films. No one was going to give me a job to make a new movie. All right, no one was going to take a chance and go, here's $1 million. And so I took my destiny out of their hands. I had written 2 other scripts before that I thought I was going to make. But this one, as I'm writing it, I knew I was going to shoot a film on it. This was the one. This was achievable.
In the end, their contract was written down on a bar napkin and stated that Quentin give Bender 2 months to look for money. But within the week, events began to unfold with incredible speed. Lawrence was a longtime student of Peter Floyd's acting school, to whom he showed the Reservoir Dogs script. Floyd jokingly asked for all the actors on the planet who Bender would choose for the main role. He answered that the role would be perfect for Harvey Keitel. But here the jokes ended, because it turned out Floyd's wife was a friend of Keitel and could send him the script anytime. In just a few days, Bender got a message on his voicemail saying that Harvey not only loved the script, he said that he must play the main role, but also promised to do everything to make sure that the project received the budget and support from the studio. With Keitel, Reservoir Dogs underwent a Cinderella transformation. After a month of talks, the budget of the picture went from Quentin's saved $30,000 to $1.5 million from the company Live Entertainment.
Looks nice.
Throughout his career, Harvey Keitel tried to trust amateur directors. He did so with Martin Scorsese first in Mean Streets and later in Taxi Driver, 2 films which paved the way for a new wave of American cinema. Both are favorites of Tarantino, by the way. But then his career took a dive, beginning with Francis Ford Coppola, who personally threw him out of Apocalypse Now and replaced him with Martin Sheen. And the main fiasco was his part in Saturn III, where he got completely dubbed over.
Yes, you have a great body. May I use it?
Things started to get better just before he agreed to do Reservoir Dogs, thanks to his roles in The Last Temptation of Christ and Thelma and Louise. In short, the decision to act for Tarantino was returning to his roots, working with young directors, and a big risk for a career that had just started to level out.
Is that supposed to be funny?
Of course, his name helped the movie. As soon as the rumor that Keitel was going to be in Reservoir Dogs was confirmed, other stars began to consider the project themselves. That's why in the early stages, Christopher Walken expressed his interest, though later he changed his mind, whereas Chris Penn, Steve Buscemi, and Tim Roth happily joined the project. Also, Samuel L. Jackson auditioned for the role of Holdaway, but Tarantino chose Randy Brooks over him.
This better not be some kind of Freddy joke, man.
That's the story of how an unknown writer with no directing experience got a star-studded cast and $1.5 million. Quentin needed to get some experience before he started shooting. So in June of 1991, he went to the Sundance Festival, which provided dozens of master classes, combining amateur cinematographers with stars of the industry. That's where Quentin and Steve Buscemi filmed a few practice scenes for Reservoir Dogs.
I mean, for all I know is you're the rat. For all I know, you're the rat.
Yeah, all right, now you're using your fucking head. Before all we know,
he's the rat.
Well, he ain't the rat because he took a bullet for me. A rat wouldn't do that.
Hey, look, asshole, man, I'm right, okay? Somebody's a fucking rat.
They showed them to more experienced colleagues who considered Tarantino's style, for lack of a better word, childish. Static shots, the camera lying on the floor, and the lack of varied perspectives caused them to laugh with contempt. The only person who was inspired by the work and gave a lot of helpful advice was Terry Gilliam. As a result, Tarantino thanked him by including Gilliam's name in the credits of the film. The film was shot in the poor suburbs of Los Angeles, but the heart of all the action became a real abandoned funeral home. Hardly anyone notices, but in this scene, for example, Michael Madsen is sitting on a hearse, surrounded by coffins, and the conversation between Harvey Keitel and Steve Buscemi happens in an embalming room.
I don't know what we did. At that point, it was every man for himself, man.
When all the locations had been found, there was little left to do. After a week of rehearsals on the 29th of July, 1991, they began filming Reservoir Dogs. The greatest challenge during the 5-week shooting process was reserved for Tim Roth. He had to lie in a puddle of fake blood for up to 10 hours a day. By the evening, the syrup and dye concoction thickened, and he had to literally be scraped off the floor. At one point, Quentin considered replacing Tim with a doll, but the actor insisted that he would lie there as long as necessary.
I was panicking for a minute back there, but I got my senses back now.
This iconic torture scene was created thanks to Robert Kurtzman, who hadn't forgotten about his promise to help with special effects, in exchange for the script from Dusk Till Dawn. While shooting, Quentin realized that he hadn't given Mr. Blue a single line, so he rewrote the opening scene in a diner between takes. As for the discussion, when Quentin's character explains the hidden meaning of Madonna's "like a virgin," he seriously thought that he had guessed her subliminal message.
You see, the pain is reminding a fuck machine what it was once like to be a virgin. Hence, like a virgin.
After the film came out, he met with Madonna and asked her if he had guessed correctly. She answered no, but that she really liked his interpretation.
I got Madonna's big dick coming out of my left ear, and Toby the Jet, I don't know what, coming out of my right.
During editing, Quentin met Harvey Weinstein for the first time. Their partnership, which was more like a bickering couple, would continue for another 27 years. Back then, Harvey insisted that they cut the torture scene from the film. This argument continued for a while, but the director remained unmoved and continued to demonstrate that no one was going to tell him how to make a movie. As for the scene, he slightly regretted leaving it in, because many would describe the film by saying, you know, that movie where the cop gets his ear cut off. The scene sparked much discussion and was the reason that it wasn't released on cassette in Great Britain and was viciously attacked by several publications. The newspaper Today stated that the scene should have been cut out, along with every other scene, maintaining that the work was nothing more than violence propaganda.
Kids shouldn't play so rough. Somebody's gonna start crying.
Quentin accepted these attacks with a smile, like Michael Madsen, who used to say that Mr. Blonde was the most positive persona in the movie.
I mean, I didn't find Mr. Blonde that bad a guy. I couldn't understand why people cheered when he was shot. I would have thought they'd be sorry to see him go, especially since he got shot by a rat. He didn't bullshit anybody. He just wanted to tell the truth.
But Madsen wasn't the only one affected by comments about his role. Steve Buscemi said that after the monologue about tips, he had to tip generously for life.
Recently, I forgot to tip a cab driver, and I thought, oh my God, if he sees the movie, he's gonna say that's the guy.
Mr. Pink's monologue was based on a real time in Tarantino's life, which his friends would often remember with distaste, since first he spent several years telling them about it, and then even immortalized his nonsense on film.
You know what this is? It's the world's smallest violin playing just for the waitresses.
Reservoir Dogs premiered at the Sundance Festival. It received so many glowing reviews there that a month later at Cannes, the film was pegged to be a revelation. Later at the film festival in Toronto, Reservoir Dogs received the prize for Best Film, and Quentin met Robert Rodriguez, who had brought his El Mariachi, which had been filmed for only $7,000. The directors quickly found common ground and became best friends, but more on that later. Meanwhile, Reservoir Dogs was released and made $3 million in the USA. This may seem unimpressive at first, but if you consider that the film was only shown in 26 theaters the first week, this number is more than adequate. In Great Britain, it was shown at 10 theaters and made £100,000 on opening weekend.
Now, the things you gotta remember are the details. It's the details that sell your story.
The picture smoothly gained momentum, and by the beginning of 1993, it was on everybody's lips. Reservoir Dogs was considered to be the best directing debut since the times of Citizen Kane. But there was a downside to all this attention. Quentin was accused multiple times of plagiarism, and while the influence of French New Wave cinema could be read between the lines, the number of similarities with the Hong Kong action movie City on Fire was truly suspicious. Here's what happens in one of the scenes of the film. A gang of robbers with the code names Brother Joe, Brother Chu, Brother Fu, and Brother Nam run after they fail to steal a diamond. The job was ruined because one of the robbers, a psychopath, started shooting. The police were lying in wait, tipped off by Brother Chu, who was undercover for the cops. During the escape, Brother Chu is saved by the more seasoned Brother Fu, who in turn provokes Brother Chu when he unloads 2 cartridges of bullets onto the cop's windshield. Brother Chu kills an innocent witness and is wounded in the stomach. Fu takes him to the meeting point at an abandoned warehouse. Fearing that they were betrayed, he calls in the big boss. The boss declares that Chu is a cop and turns the barrel of his gun on him. Fu reacts because he thinks Chu is innocent, and he gets out his gun too. The next scene finds them in a belligerent standoff. Look familiar?
That's your proof? You don't need proof when you have instinct.
Of course. It's worth mentioning that this is only a 20-minute segment of City on Fire. Although the connection can't be ignored, the style, dialogue, and plot structure of the films are completely different. But of course, this topic was too good for journalists to pass up at press conferences. At the Cannes Film Festival, Tarantino gave the press a clear answer.
I love City on Fire, and I have the poster for it framed in my house. It's a great movie. I steal from every movie. I steal from every single movie ever made. I love it. If my work has anything, it's that I'm taking this from this and that from that and mixing them together. And if people don't like them, then tough titty. Don't go and see it, all right? I steal from everything. Great artists steal. They don't do homages.
Many were not satisfied by this explanation, but Quentin completely unarmed the critics with his candor, which only added to his popularity. Catherine James was receiving calls from every agent, every producer, and every studio representative who were asking for Tarantino's previous screenplays. She sent them the same works which had been lying around the offices for years, unread, despite her having begged them to read them earlier. It's no surprise that right after the release of Reservoir Dogs, they started work on True Romance and Natural Born Killers. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back during the masterclasses at the Sundance Institute, Tarantino had met Tony Scott. Tony had been wanting to make a crime action film and offered to buy the rights to Reservoir Dogs. But Tarantino refused and asked him to read True Romance instead. He read it in one evening, and by the next day had used all his connections to buy the rights and find a $30 million budget. He also got Roger Avary to join the project, since the first version of the screenplay was his. Roger tweaked the screenplay a little bit to find the director's needs, and also rewrote the finale. Tony knew that this upset Quentin, whereas Scott's happy end was a compromise with Hollywood's expectations of a commercial film. But in fact, the director made 2 versions of the finale and chose the one which he believed worked the best. Tarantino never publicly shared his disappointment and called his work on True Romance exceptional.
Hello?
Hello, baby.
Clarence? You got it. Clarence, it's great to hear from you, man. What's going on?
I think by far he's the better guy to have done this movie. And also, it was exciting. The idea of seeing my world through Tony's eyes and have it look like that. True Romance was produced by a company created by Quentin and Lawrence Bender, A Band Apart, named after the Jean-Luc Godard film Band Apart. Later, the company worked on all of Tarantino's films and partnered with Robert Rodriguez, John Woo, Tim Burton, Darren Aronofsky,
and Luc Besson. After the premiere of True Romance, Quentin helped to promote the picture by going on the promo tour. And though he wasn't being paid for that, he went to great lengths to ensure the film's success at the box office. However, with Natural Born Killers, it was a different story.
My name will get brought up from time to time, but I think I've done a pretty good job of distancing myself from the film. Basically, if you like it, it's all Oliver. Good, bad, or indifferent. It has very little to do with me.
It's literally a candy lane of murder and mayhem.
To this day, Tarantino has not seen the film and doesn't want to discuss it. From the moment that the screenplay made it into Oliver Stone's hands, a quiet war began between the two directors. As you may remember, Tarantino had given the rights for Natural Born Killers to his friend, Ran Vossler, who had spent the last 4 years trying to make the movie and dreamed of directing it himself. Quentin had named only one condition. Ran was to shoot a small excerpt so that Quentin could make sure that their vision was the same. At that stage, Vossler had begun to collaborate with Don Murphy, who promised him $3 million for the budget. According to Tarantino, Vossler signed a contract with him, and 3 days later was removed as director and made co-producer instead. Having gotten his hands on the screenplay, Murphy passed it to Oliver Stone, who pretty much rewrote the whole thing with his colleagues. Tarantino was furious and said several times that everyone who was part of creating that film just wanted to use his newfound glory. Murphy countered by saying that he would never bet on a director whose Reservoir Dogs made less at the box office than Leprechaun.
You can't fix Ozzy's brain. I know that.
In another interview, Murphy explained that they had to rewrite the screenplay because, like all of Tarantino's screenplays, it seemed to be made up only of expletives.
Are you gonna bark all day, little doggy? Or are you gonna bite?
Similar quips and snide comments continued for more than a year, until both sides came to an agreement, whereby Tarantino would stop airing his discontent in exchange for a tidy sum. He also insisted that his name not appear in the credits, though it ended up there anyway. A humble line read, "Story by Quentin Tarantino." Thanks to the agreement, Quentin made more than $500,000 in royalties on this project. Oliver Stone thought it was incredibly hypocritical to sever all ties with the film, but then agreed to receive royalties and a percentage of the profit. He was also highly displeased when he found out that Quentin had told the actors from Reservoir Dogs that if they ever worked with Stone, they would never work with him again. The story reached its climax with the release of a non-fiction book entitled Killer Instinct, which told the story of the creation of Natural Born Killers. Within the pages, it's easy to find dozens of jabs and insults pointed at Quentin, with most quotes belonging to Don Murphy.
If Quentin didn't agree with what was published in my book, he should have taken his grievances to a court of law. That's the civilized recourse society has provided for these agreements.
But Quentin didn't take them to court. On the 22nd of November 1997, in a Los Angeles restaurant, he beat Murphy up. He was stopped by the police on his way out, but Don didn't press charges. The conflict was mediated by Miramax co-founder Harvey Weinstein, who convinced the enemies to shake on it. But a few days later, Tarantino went on the Keenan Ivory Wayans show and gladly described, in detail, how he'd bitch-slapped Murphy. He sued Tarantino and demanded $5 million in moral damages. The case was rejected, and both sides agreed to stop talking dirt about each other.
Hey, fuck you, buddy boy.
Fuck you.
All right, fuck you too.
Fuck you talking to.
All right? Hey, fuck off.
But let's go back to 1992. After the premiere of Reservoir Dogs, Quentin spent 6 months in Amsterdam. The first few months he did what everyone does in Amsterdam. Later, Roger Avery joined him, and they started work on the screenplay that would later become Pulp Fiction. Quentin already had in his hands the proposal for his next project, with a budget of at least $1 million. This happened thanks to Danny DeVito, who was devastated at not being able to participate in the making of Reservoir Dogs. Later, Danny would make studios pay just to read a new Tarantino script, and later became the producer for Pulp Fiction, helping Quentin to receive an $8.5 million budget. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, the screenwriters had come up with something epic. They took all the drafts and decided to combine them into a new project. First, Avery's Chaos Rules the World became the Golden Watch scene. They also added a deleted scene with the soiled car interior from True Romance, a perfected story about a date, and a dialogue that never made it into Natural Born Killers.
We're not at the finish yet, baby.
By mid-1993, they had it finished. Quentin asked Avery to continue working on the movie with him, but Roger needed money fast because he wanted to get married and to shoot his own film, Killing Zoe. So he sold the rights to Pulp Fiction.
It's legal to sell it.
The rights were bought immediately by Miramax Studios, and Tarantino began preparations for shooting. He was able to get almost the whole Reservoir Dogs team: Tim Roth, Steve Buscemi, Harvey Keitel, producer Lawrence Bender, creative director and designer David and Sandy Wasco, operator and dressage Secula, who after a severe accident filmed Pulp Fiction from a wheelchair, and his irreplaceable helper and main supporter, editor Sally Menke.
I knew from meeting Quentin that it was going to be something really special.
Then he began casting the other roles. The main hero was to be Vic Vega, whose part was written for Michael Madsen, who rejected the role in favor of playing opposite Kevin Costner in Wyatt Earp. Later, he would come to regret that decision. The character was turned into Vic's brother, Vincent, and producer Lawrence Bender was planning on inviting Daniel Day-Lewis to play the part. But Quentin had an idea, which caused everyone to think him bat crazy.
Vincent.
Yes. Now it's difficult to imagine anyone else playing Vincent Vega, but by 1993 no one was taking John Travolta seriously anymore. In the 70s, the head of Disney Studios, Michael Eisner, called him the biggest star on the planet since he had been nominated for an Oscar for Saturday Night Fever, and starred in the cult favorite Grease. However, a series of unfortunate decisions led him to act in films like Chains of Gold, The Experts, and Look Who's Talking.
As much as I liked John Travolta, I couldn't bring myself to watch some fucking talking baby movie.
Oh! Who is that?
People had stopped taking Travolta seriously, but Tarantino saw genius in him. In one of his favorite films, Blowout, by Brian De Palma, Travolta put on what Quentin would call one of the best acting performances in the history of cinema. From their first meeting, it was clear fate brought them together. When he stepped into Tarantino's cluttered apartment, Travolta, who owned a 20-bedroom mansion in Maine, apartments in Florida, and 3 personal jets, was shocked. Quentin was living at the same apartment that John had rented when he first arrived in Los Angeles in 1974.
Nobody knows it right from the start. I gave you my heart. Whoa.
After Tarantino spent several hours quoting lines from Travolta's movies, played Grease the board game with him, and showed him the complete collection of his films, John accepted the offer to play Vincent Vega.
All right, it was a miracle. Can we go now?
To Tarantino's surprise, the decision to cast Travolta was not met with universal applause. It even became the reason why the heads of Miramax started to doubt their investment in the project. Even Lawrence Bender was unsure in the beginning. You can get anybody in the world. Why do you want John Travolta? But Tarantino didn't budge. It was Travolta, or no one. And he even told the producers that he wouldn't make the film if John wasn't in it.
Don't be looking at me like that, all right? I can feel your look.
Once again, under pressure from Quentin, the producers and the studio backed off. Later, thanks to Keitel, the cast was joined by his neighbor, Bruce Willis. Turns out he was a fan of Reservoir Dogs and could quote any line from it. Though Quentin had initially hoped to get Sylvester Stallone to play Butch, he was so impressed with Willis's enthusiasm that he chose him, giving yet another actor's career a second wind.
So, Mr. Willis, let me ask you a question here. Is this the finest moment of your acting career, or what?
The pinnacle. From here on in, it slides down the backside of the
Pulp Fiction allowed critics to see Bruce for the first time as more than
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
As for Samuel L. Jackson, despite having a role written specifically for him, he almost jumped ship when he came to a reading only to find it was an audition with another candidate, Paul Calderon,
Oh, Vincent Vega, our man in Amsterdam.
who initially got the part. After that, Samuel went to see Tarantino in person and read the monologue from the Bible, adding in some of his own improvisations.
And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger.
His skill amazed the director so much that Tarantino cast him in almost all of his films and never made him audition again.
That's all you had to say.
As for those who didn't make it into the film, it's worth mentioning that Ellen DeGeneres auditioned for the role, which was eventually played by Rosanna Arquette.
Which one's Trippy? One with all the shit in her face? No, that's Jody. That's my wife.
Finally, having read the screenplay to Uma Thurman over the phone and convincing her to participate, on the 20th of September, 1993, he began shooting Pulp Fiction. Filming had started, and still, Quentin was choosing who he was going to play. Though he saw himself as Lance the drug dealer, he decided on playing the anxious Jimmy.
Don't fucking Jimmy me, Jules! Okay?
Thinking that he wanted to be on the other side of the camera in the final scene. Vincent Vega and Marcellus Wallace's wife. The scenes involving Tarantino were directed by Robert Rodriguez.
They look like a couple of dorks.
Ha ha ha, you're closed, motherfucker.
When one thinks of Pulp Fiction, one instantaneously pictures the interior of the Jack Rabbit Slim's restaurant.
Long waiting on the bell to ring so I can go home. Throw my books on a table, pick up the telephone. Come on, baby, let's
The decorations for it cost $100,000. No wonder the milkshakes were so expensive.
Did you just order a $5 shake?
Mm-hmm.
On a serious note, besides the obvious references, there were a few more interesting ones. The walls of the restaurant were hung with posters of Roger Corman's films, one of Tarantino's favorite directors. The waiter, played by Steve Buscemi, looks like one of Quentin's favorite musicians, Buddy Holly. And the tables made of cars were borrowed from the movie Speedway, starring Elvis Presley.
And all you gotta do is just let yourself go.
By the way, the same building that was home to Jack Rabbit Slim's also housed Butch's hotel room, the room which Vincent and Jules enter, and the basement of the Mason-Dixie pawn shop. It was from the parking lot of this very building, during filming, that Quentin's car was stolen, the same car which Vincent drives in the movie. 20 years later, a policeman found it accidentally when he stopped two teens who were stealing it from its new owner, who had no idea that he had spent the last 15 years riding around in Quentin Tarantino's car.
What's more chicken shit than fucking with a man's automobile? I mean, don't fuck with another man's vehicle. You don't do it. It's just against the rules.
In Pulp Fiction, Quentin included more references than in any other of his works. Vince and Mia's dance was a reference to 8.5. Butch and Marcel's meeting, Psycho. And the glowing case was from Kiss Me Deadly. As for the dialogues, half of the movie was references to other films.
You want that gun, don't you, Zed? Go ahead and pick it up.
You want that gun? Pick it up. I wish you would.
The most important of which was Jules' sermon, which practically copied Karate Kiba.
And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious
anger, who poison and destroy
my brothers.
Considering the result of the premiere, which occurred at Cannes in May of 1994, it's hard to believe that the film only cost $8.5 million. Hell, just Bruce Willis's paycheck for Die Hard 2 was bigger than the whole budget for Pulp Fiction.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
A few days later, Quentin received the grand prize of the film festival.
Pulp Fiction.
Cannes started a chain reaction. The movie received awards, from the Film Critics Association for Best Picture, Best Directing, Best Screenplay, Best Acting done by John Travolta, as well as Golden Globe and BAFTA for Best Screenplay, as well as 7 Oscar nominations. Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor and Actress, Best Director, Screenplay, and Film Editing. But at the 67th Academy Awards ceremony, Pulp Fiction together with The Shawshank Redemption were victims of the sweeping success that was Forrest Gump.
I gotta pee.
I believe he said he had to go pee.
It was one of the most predictable battles for the Oscars, but Pulp Fiction did get a statuette for Best Original Screenplay, and their acceptance speech is considered to be one of the best in the history of the Oscars.
My wife Gretchen, who I love more than anything in the world, and I really have to take a pee right now, so I'm gonna go. Thank you.
While he was working on Pulp Fiction, Quentin had agreed to play in a few of his friends' movies. Of course, if he had known how much attention would be drawn to his film and to himself, he probably wouldn't have done it. But since he had promised, he couldn't back out now. Filming the cameo roles for Rory Kelly's Sleep With Me and Alexander Rockwell's Somebody to Love took less than a day.
Where the opposite sex is the fact that you think funny gets you somewhere, all right? But funny doesn't get your dick sucked. What can I get you? Yeah, like a beer.
The same can be said for the phenomenal moment in Robert Rodriguez's Desperado.
Muchas gracias.
However, for his role in Destiny Turns on the Radio, he had to set aside several weeks right in the middle of the promo tour of his own film.
For every ending, there's a new beginning.
What are you, goddamn fortune cookie?
That was the moment when Pulp Fiction became a box office success, making over $200 million and having broken even 25 times over. At the end of '94, Quentin and a few of his close friends, Robert Rodriguez, Alexander Rockwell, and Allison Anders, collaborated on a film called 4 Rooms. There was supposed to be 5 rooms, but Richard Linklater, the 5th in the group, declined to film his episode. Things didn't work out with the lead actor either. All the directors wrote their episodes with Steve Buscemi in mind, but he was too busy and was replaced by Tim Roth.
I've got to get out of here.
Money!
The episode shot by Quentin was a retelling of a story from Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which the characters themselves openly admit to.
You ever see the one called The Man from Rio with Peter Lorre and Steve McQueen?
Besides Tim Roth, the main roles were played by Tarantino,
Chester, not Sir, Chester.
Paul Calderon, who Quentin hired as a kind of apology for not giving him the role of Jules, and Bruce Willis. An interesting fact about Bruce: when he played the part for free, he broke the rules of the Actors Guild, and because of that wasn't mentioned in the credits.
Okay, Ellen, I'm sorry. I'm fucking sorry about that. What am I gonna do?
Speaking of the credits, they're almost the best thing of the movie. Unfortunately, complete failure awaited the film. Critics tore it apart, dubbing it the main disappointment of the year.
Why should that surprise anybody? When the hell has America, ever been fair? We might be right every once in a while, but we're very rarely fair.
Alexander Rockwell and Allison Anders' episodes were dragged through the dirt. And though Tarantino and Rodriguez were not quite so unfortunate, it still didn't help the picture to break even, becoming the first and only financial train wreck in Quentin's career. But there was no time to grieve, since in 1995, 6 years after it was written, the screenplay for From Dusk Till Dawn was finally approved.
Come on in, pussy lovers!
Having decided to focus on the role of Richard Gecko, Quentin asked Robert Rodriguez to take the director's chair.
And because me and Robert were friends and buddies and stuff, and he read it and he came back and he goes, "Man, this is a really cool script. I'd do this tomorrow, man."
Recognize this.
He didn't recognize shit.
Seth, I'm telling you, the way he looked at us, you especially, I knew he knew.
Miramax gave the project a $19 million budget, which was more than all the duo's previous film budgets combined. That was how the friends received complete creative freedom and began to cast actors for the roles. The first to be picked were Quentin and Rodriguez's friends, Harvey Keitel.
Has anybody here read a real book about vampires, or are we just remembering what some movie said?
Juliette Lewis.
Where are you taking us?
Mexico.
What's in Mexico?
Mexicans.
Danny Trejo.
Welcome to the Titty Twister.
And Cheech Marin.
You can find cheaper pussy anywhere. Fuck it.
Later, as a nod to B-movies, roles were given to B-movie star Fred Williamson.
Anything you got to say to them? Say to me first.
And makeup artist Tom Savini, who had worked on Friday the 13th and Dawn of the Dead.
I met Quentin a long time ago at a convention where I was a guest of honor. Quentin was a kid in the crowd. Said, Mr. Savini, I wonder if you'd come by this video store where I work and sign some of your videos. We have lots of old videos. You probably like them. We're in Manhattan Beach. Okay. I went because I'm nice to everybody. You know why? They grew up to be Quentin Tarantino.
Next, Robert Rodriguez brought Salma Hayek to the project, who initially kept rejecting the proposal because of her fear of snakes. Rodriguez even lied, saying that he'd offered the part to Madonna, after which Salma went to 2 months of psychotherapy to get rid of her phobia. However, the biggest challenge was finding someone to play Seth Gecko. Quentin offered the part to John Travolta, Michael Madsen, and Christopher Walken. Robert offered it to Antonio Banderas, but everyone had a reason for turning it down. But while Tarantino was filming the final episodes of ER as a guest director, he met George Clooney and offered him the part. From Dusk Till Dawn became his big screen debut.
I'm fucking playing with you, asshole. Do you want this little girl to die, or that little girl, or yourself?
There are a few interesting facts worth mentioning, one of which is the wonderful reference to cheap films of the 80s, where one actor was often used to play several different characters.
Hey, not so fast.
Step aside, asshole.
Cycles? Or... What was that?
And another is that Jules' monologue from Pulp Fiction was initially written for the head of the Fuller family. And of course, the reference to the screenwriter's own foot fetish. Thanks to the role of Richard Gecko, Quentin found himself in the company of Val Kilmer, Burt Reynolds, and Marlon Brando. All of these actors were nominated for a Golden Raspberry for Worst Supporting Actor in '96.
You think it was funny?
Nonetheless, many consider it to be the best performance of Tarantino's acting career. He was able to bring to the screen a real psychopath without exaggerated grimaces and pages of text which he usually hid behind. Years later, many critics began to observe that his performance was one of the highlights of the movie.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. Can we one more time? I'm sorry.
The picture was released in January of '96 and led the box office its opening weekend, but then lost momentum, collecting around $30 million. This number was a disappointment for Miramax Studios, which had high hopes for the project. The press didn't help the picture either. It not only criticized Tarantino, but found fault with Rodriguez and Clooney as well. But, as always, time will tell, since Dusk Till Dawn became a cult classic, which entertains movie lovers to this day. And though Quentin's acting skills were subject to vicious attacks, his ability to write scripts was never in question. So as soon as Quentin finished filming, Tony Scott invited him to help with the dialogues for Crimson Tide starring Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman.
The one thing is some of the dialogue was just a little like normal movie dialogue. It had its brain. It just needed a little bit more of a heart. So I took it and did a rewrite on it. Although I actually didn't change any scenes. I just changed the dialogue. Just tried to bring more characterization.
Who played the German sub-commander in The Enemy Below with Robert Mitchum? Was it Kurt Jurgens or Hardy Kruger? Sir. Wrong answer! Drop down and give me 20! Now!
Quentin is a very rare animal, yeah. That what he does, he brings a reality to these people with a sense of humor. And it's very difficult to find a writer who can give you darkness and humor together.
Despite a few setbacks, interest in Tarantino grew, and the question, what would be the writer's next big picture, tormented all of Hollywood's news outlets. His opponents never missed an opportunity to mention that his previous works were co-written with Roger Avary, and that without him, Quentin couldn't produce a single line. The pressure grew when he rejected the offers to direct Speed and Men in Black. It was only by the end of 1996 that he announced that his next project would be a screen adaptation of Elmore Leonard's novel, Rum Punch. Having bought the rights to the novel a few years back, the director nursed the idea for several years, making lots of changes to the original source. He switched the location from Florida to his familiar Los Angeles, changed the skin color and last name of the heroine, the name of the movie to Jackie Brown, and of course, spiced up the dialogue.
What's wrong with you knocking on the door like the goddamn police? You looking to get shot?
Thought you might be asleep.
You keep fucking with me, you the one gonna be asleep. Forever.
He made so many changes that for more than a year he was afraid to show the screenplay to the book's author. But when Elmore read it, he told Tarantino that it was the best script he had read in his entire life. Emboldened by the author's support, at the beginning of 1997, Quentin began casting the main roles. Pam Grier was an obvious choice for him. When the actress came to the audition, Quentin's office walls had been hung with her posters.
And I said, "Did you put this up because I was coming over?" And he said, "No, I was gonna take them down because you were coming over."
Is that what I think it is?
What do you think it is?
I think it's a gun pressed up against my dick.
Well, you thought right.
He also desperately wanted to work with Robert Forster. They met back in '91 when Robert came to audition for the part of Joe Cabot in Reservoir Dogs.
I had read for him about 5 years prior for Reservoir Dogs, and I thought I killed that audition.
But Tarantino chose Lawrence Tierney, while promising Forster that their paths would definitely cross. 6 years later, he met him at a restaurant.
The thing happened right here at this table. Over there walks in Quentin Tarantino.
And offered him a role which brought the actor his first Oscar nomination and resurrected his career.
And this guy gave me a gift, the size of which cannot be exaggerated.
I'm Max Cherry, Dale Bondsman.
It's weird that no nominations were given to De Niro, who played a very atypical role for himself.
That's Japan.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, it looks, I could tell.
Want to fuck?
Yeah.
Or to Samuel L. Jackson, whose performance makes your blood run cold. Take the scene with Chris Tucker, for example.
I'm sorry, man, but I ain't getting no goddamn trunk.
As for Chris Tucker, soon after this small role in Tarantino's film, Tucker got famous, and for a time became one of the highest paid actors in the world. Quentin often expressed his disappointment with the lack of nominations for Grier, saying that she deserved to become the first black actress to receive an Oscar for a lead role.
Come on, it's getting silly now.
Oh, silly? You want to see some motherfucking silly? If I have to tell you to shut up one more time, I'm gonna shut you up.
By that time, Tarantino's ability to breathe new life into an actor's deflated career had become legendary. He was often interrogated about who he was going to save next.
All right, I'm not coming from that place. I'm trying to cast the best actors, or the coolest actors, in whatever role. And I'm not using the hot star list in order to do it.
Thinking about you every day, and I don't even know.
Jackie Brown premiered on the 29th of December, 1997, and made $10 million the first weekend, while having a budget of only $12 million. In total, the picture made it to the $74 million mark. It wasn't the success of Pulp Fiction, but it wasn't a failure, though. That's exactly how Quentin felt about it. In addition to the lack of nominations for Best Director and Best Screenplay, the less than exuberant reviews were what pulled the rug out from under him. He reacted aggressively to news headlines like, "The grossly overrated Tarantino," saying it was the press that had spent the last 5 years overestimating him in the first place. To describe what he was feeling, it would be enough to say that his next movie would come out 6 years later. A few months after the premiere of Jackie Brown, Quentin made another attempt to make it as an actor in the play Wait Until Dark with Marissa Tomei. The Broadway premiere ended with a standing ovation. In the audience were many of Tarantino's fans and colleagues, and it seemed that a play with $3 million in pre-sale tickets was bound to be a success and become a Broadway sensation, and it did. In the reviews the next day, the critics attacked Quentin with such ferocity that it eclipsed all the bad press that he had received during his whole career. And though Tarantino parried the blows with scathing comments back at his opponents, he was not prepared for the battle against the theater critics. 2 months later, having played the required amount of shows, he left Broadway. After this series of unfortunate events, shattered and upset, Quentin Tarantino shut himself up in a small apartment and began to write a new script. The Nameless project was about the Second World War, combining 3 stories, none of which had a finale. Unable to overcome his writing block, Tarantino left the bustle of New York and Los Angeles and spent a year and a half in Austin, Texas.
That's what I love about Austin. It's just so damn small.
Resigned to smoking marijuana, drinking, and watching thousands of films in the company of his faithful friends, Robert Rodriguez, Richard Linklater, and Mike Judge. However, he quickly tired of the pointless waste of time and found an annual festival called QT, where he would show favorite movies from his gigantic collection and tell stories of forgotten, unrecognized directors and present new pictures of unknown filmmakers from around the world.
Well, the movie will start in just a little bit. Then what we're going to do is afterwards, I'm going to come back. And I'm going to talk about a couple anecdotes about the film and mention a few facts.
In 2000, Quentin returned to Los Angeles to act in the comedy Little Nicky, where he played the deacon.
He loves all of his children while he loves you.
That's the
And he loves you.
During the visit to LA, he went to a party hosted by Miramax and bumped into Uma Thurman. They started reminiscing about making Pulp Fiction, and the actress reminded Quentin that once he had come into her trailer with the idea for a screenplay.
When I woke, every emotion in me was dead. Every emotion that is except one. Desire. The desire for revenge.
She remembered that the story was based on Francois Truffaut's film, The Bride Wore Black. It was about a female murderer who was shot at in a clock tower by a gang led by Bill, but she survived and wanted revenge. That evening, Thurman asked him the most important question of her career.
Are we ever going to do Kill Bill?